You may have heard this story before, but in 1981, this is when I first started high school. I was a freshman, I think. There was a millionaire businessman named Eugene M. Lang. And he went to a school in New York called PS 121, which means Public School 121. I guess in New Jersey, New York area, there's so many schools, they just basically decide to name them, the numbers. So that elementary school he had attended in this is in Harlem, in East Harlem, 50 years before. So in 1931 is when he attended. And so he was invited back as a successful alumni of this school in East Harlem to come and speak. And he's white, obviously, he's not like everybody else there now. The ethnic mix was mostly Hispanic and African American. And so when he went back there, he was getting ready and he had this message, work hard and you'll succeed. And that's what he was all prepared to these sixth graders that were about to graduate. But on the way up to the podium, he was sitting next to the principal. The principal said, here's a horrible statistic, but 75% of this school's students will never finish high school. 2/3 will drop out and never finish high school. And that kind of hit him because he thought, well, that's not the way it was when I was here, but now all of a sudden he realized that the changes. And just on the spur of the moment, he went up and he modified his speech a little bit. And as he went up, here's the one thing that most people heard that he said. He said his whole spiel about work hard and you'll succeed. But at the very end of it, what he modified it by was he said this. He said, I promise some form of tuition to help you in college if you stay in high school and graduate. Now, there are 61 kids, and, he's a multimillionaire, he's wealthy and all that, but on the spur of the moment, he made that kind of promise. And as a result, he started a foundation called I Have a Dream Foundation, based on, the famous speech by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And so he started looking and thinking and giving money and bringing other people who had money. How can we help students and kids in these, schools that are not doing well in bad neighborhoods to have a dream, to have, just a goal and to succeed in life. And as a result, that's where it started all from. Just kind of the spur of the moment, because you know what he realized at that moment? He said, so what if they stay in middle school and high school and they somehow graduate because their school is not very good? They're not likely to get into college. And if they are able to get into college, their parents have never been there before. They don't really push them to it. They don't have any money to be able to go, even if they were to get scholarships, unless they get full rides and full scholarships, which is difficult even back then, even now, because why? Because oftentimes to get that, you not only have to be academic, but there's something, you have to be at the top. And I know there's need-based scholarships and all these things going on, but he realized in that moment that without hope, they could not even have a dream. Do you guys understand that? Without hope, you can't even begin to dream. And the funny thing is as you live your life, I know some of you are really, really young, but I'm sure you've experienced a little bit of this, but as you get older, into your 20s, 30s, 40s, into your 50s, as you get older, what you'll find, and I haven't been on the other side of that, so I don't know, but what I know is there will always be at some point in your life when there's a lull, when you almost feel like giving up, and there's a kind of sense of hopelessness. And it's not always this major sense of disaster and all is lost, I just might as well give up and I wish I were dead. Not that kind of thing necessarily, but sometimes because as you live your life, you have all this optimism, you have all these dreams, you have all these ideas of what you want to achieve, and somewhere along the line you get knocked around by life enough that you kind of let go of some of those dreams one by one, saying, well, that's not really practical, that's not really realistic, that's never going to happen, and you kind of let go. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily bad, because some things are very unrealistic, some things never will happen, but sometimes what happens that's even worse than that is that our sense of hope, our sense of dreaming kind of dies. In other words, we no longer hope and dream for something bigger than what we can see, touch, feel, those kinds of things. Sorry guys, I'm having a little bit of problems with this. Let me see if I can put this over. Okay, this will help. All right, I think that'll keep it from moving around. And what's interesting to me is as you go along in your life, there are times when you have to make a decision. am I going to maintain a sense of hope in my life or not? I think I've seen enough people now that I'm older, among my friends and some people that maybe a little bit older than I am, and I see basically two kinds of people in this area. There's some that now have kind of given up, and so I don't want to call them cynical because some of them are optimists, but they've kind of let go of this sense of hope. They just kind of live and they just take life as it is, and they still may be optimistic about little things, but on the big things they've kind of let go. And then I see other people that maybe some people call them dreamers or still call them, pie in the sky, whatever else, but they still have that. And it's not necessarily that one's necessarily better than the other, but either case I see this, and what I find is what's really critical is, what are you basing your hope on? And if you have lost hope, why have you lost hope? Can you find that hope once again? And if you have hope, is it based upon something pie in the sky, or is it based on some kind of reality? When I look at Mark chapter 1, at the end of Mark chapter 1, I believe that Jesus is the one upon whom we must place all our hopes. If you think about this story, it begins with a leper coming to Jesus and imploring him, kneeling down and saying, if you will, you can make me clean. And you've probably heard a little bit about leprosy here and there over the years, and so we don't know exactly what kind of diseases we're talking about. It was obviously some kind of skin disease that made them unclean. And in Jesus' day, they thought it was contagious, and it is, but it's very hard to catch the kind of leprosy we're talking about here, other than through bodily fluids or through blood and things of that nature. And so they were quarantined. We know that whole thing that's going on right now with Ebola, right? But they were quarantined, and what would happen is it would be a degenerative disease, and usually what we're talking about here, when people got well, it wasn't because they actually had leprosy. They had some form of eczema or some kind of rash that was really bad, and they would go show themselves to the priest or whatever the medical authority that they believed in, and they would say, okay, you've been clean for about a week now, and nothing's happened, you're clean, you can come back into society, and they would let them back in. And so the leper we're talking about here is someone who's been outside the community, who's been ostracized, who's not getting better, who probably has a form of Hansen's disease, which means that your nerve endings begin to die, and as a result, you can no longer feel any pain. And what happens is, because of that, your body begins to deteriorate, and anytime you break a finger or get a cut, you don't notice it, you don't sense it, and as a result, you get infected, and you don't feel the pain, and you don't get a fever, you don't have any symptoms that you can feel or sense, and as a result, your body gets weaker and weaker and weaker, and it becomes more atrophied, it becomes more diseased, it becomes more broken, and eventually that's why we have photos of people who quote-unquote have leprosy, where their tips of their noses are gone, or their fingers are all messed up and they have sores all over, but because they no longer feel it, and because they don't know anything, it just goes on. They can put their feet or their hands in scalding water and not feel it. They can cause third-degree burns, and it doesn't affect them. So this is what's going on. And so in the day of Jesus, leprosy was probably considered one of the worst diseases to catch for several reasons. Number one, it was slow. The progress of it was very slow, the progression. And as a result, it wasn't something quick, and you lost everything. See, leprosy, what it does is it took away the hope of the people. It isolates you from every meaningful relationship. Are you married? You have a wife? You can no longer be with your wife. Are you married and have a husband? You can no longer be with your husband or your children or your family or your friends, unless they too chose to be ostracized with you and join and go outside. It took away your human dignity. Because you could no longer contribute to the greater society. You couldn't have a job. All you could do, no matter what position you had in your life before, I'm sure the wealthier were able to still sustain because, they would set up a house for them and do whatnot. But for the most common people, what they would have to do is they would have to beg, and they have to eat garbage or whatever anybody else threw out. And people wouldn't want to be near them whatsoever because of fear of catching that same illness. And so no longer did you have a purpose. No longer were you able to contribute. You lost any meaning. You lost all your human dignity. It might make you question about God. If you believe that God existed, you might say, is God good? Why does he allow this kind of suffering? And so all of these things would happen and would begin to weigh upon you. It would isolate you emotionally, spiritually, physically. And you can imagine some of the people thinking like, even their closest beloved ones now turning their backs upon them sometimes, and they would look at that and they would probably become bitter in their own spirit and in their own heart. And you could imagine these people sometimes degenerating first maybe into anger or resentment, and then getting into bitterness, and then maybe even to a place of despair and hopelessness and just wanting to die. And maybe even committing suicide. And so when you're talking about leprosy and a leper coming to Jesus, you're talking about a group of people who would know the depths of despair, who would know about what it is to not have any hope in their lives. If anyone knew, these folks are the ones that knew, especially in the age and the time of Jesus. Now, what's interesting to me that we need to really look at is we all go through seasons where we lose hope and we lose despair. It's not continual like it was for these lepers, but here's this leper. He begins to hear the stories and the rumors about Jesus, and he begins to hear about the miracles and the healing and about the casting out of demons. And this leper, all of a sudden within him, what springs up? Hope. He says, maybe if I go, my life can be changed. I really believe that when we hope in Jesus Christ, we can have a hope that is unfailing, that will sustain us through anything. That's what the Bible says. They says Jesus is the foundation, that Jesus is the rock. He's the one through which we can get through everything. But I think we can learn from this leper, how do we appropriate that hope? The first thing that I find from this leper is this. He knows that there is nowhere else that he can go. One of the things that I find for Christians and also for people who have a hard time, maybe they've understood the message of the gospel, they've understood the Bible, and it seems like Jesus is love and all these things that sound so good, and yet they can't quite trust it and they can't quite grasp a hold of it. I believe it's because they do not have that place where they feel like everything else doesn't work, this is my only hope. This leper had nowhere else to go. He had no other place. And the thing that I want you to understand, our sin condition means that we have nowhere else that we can go. When the Bible says that Jesus is the only way, that he's the way, the truth, and the light, what it's saying is there's no other cure, there's no other place. I'm sorry, but that's it. It's not just trying to be exclusive and every religion is wrong. That's not the thrust of saying that Jesus is the only way. What the point about Jesus being the only way is he's the only one that can actually deal with your sin. There's nothing else. I don't care how good the teachings of other religions are. They all fall short and will leave you in a place of wanting more, of despair, of lack. That's the reality of it. It's not that just Christians are just jealous about their religion and we don't want anybody else to compete, and so we want to knock down every other religion. I think there's beauty and there's truth and there's things in other religions that are good, but they all fall short because they do not have the person of Christ. See, we don't believe in a religion, we believe in a person. And as a result, we have to come to a place in order to have unfailing hope in our life, in order to be able to go through everything and still have that hope alive and well in our life, we have to understand that the only place that can be found is in Jesus Christ. And so this leper comes to Jesus, and here's what he says. He says, if you will, you can make me clean. Nobody else, you. And here's his position when he comes. He begs in despair. He begs in desperation, and he kneels down before Jesus as he says that. The only way that we can have hope is by understanding our weakness, our need, and saying, you are my only hope. See, I think a lot of Christians, they still struggle with trying to do it their way. They still struggle with not being able to fully admit that it is only by God and by His grace. And as a result, we deny ourselves the hope. See, if this leper is still on the outside looking in and he's still checking Jesus out, and he's like saying, well, maybe if I run around close enough to him and see what he does, maybe I can pick up some things and see how he's doing these miracles, and maybe we can find some way, or I don't have to take this risk, I don't have to surrender, I don't have to kneel down, I don't have to do all that. But instead, if I can just kind of figure out the solution to my issue, and then I can move on. Why? Because we don't want to surrender to Jesus Christ. See, this leper knew that in order to come before Jesus, somehow he knew intrinsically that he had to kneel down, that he had to surrender to the authority of Jesus Christ in order to have hope rekindled for his life. And he says, if you will, you can make me clean. That's pretty amazing. You see that a lot of us, we go through this, we're not willing to quite admit that we need that help. And we're not quite ready to admit that we can't do it on our own. I remember, I don't know, it was like when I was like 5th grade or 6th grade. And, I don't know about you guys, but for me, I was a really skinny kid until like 5th grade. And then I didn't grow taller, I just grew wider for a while. And I still remember this. I don't know why, but this is something that I just remember. But every time we went shopping, because you go shopping with your mom back when you're in elementary school, and you would go shopping, and I still remember this very clearly, but clothing manufacturers are so smart. Instead of, oh, your kid's a little fat, so he needs the big boy clothes, they don't say it that way. The way that they're all labeled is generous fit, or husky size, or for women, for the full-figured woman. That's the way it works out, right? But the thing is that somewhere along the line, the clothing manufacturers know this. They want to lull you into say, no, you're okay. I'm not saying that it's wrong to be bigger or this. That's not what I'm getting at. But if you really want to deal with some issue that you have in your life, then you have to kind of look at it face to face and not sugarcoat it and say, okay, can I really deal with this? And the reality is until we do that, we can't begin that path of hope. The leper knew, nope, there's no other way. And so he knew to kneel down. He knew to kneel down. The second thing that I want to point out to you is this. When he says, if you will, you can make me clean, here's what it says in verse 41. Moved with pity, he stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, I will, be clean. And immediately the leprosy left him and he was made clean. Maybe if you read that, you're like, okay, Jesus was cool. Because we already know about him. He's loving. He stretches out his hand and he touches him and he says, I will be clean. Maybe you've heard, by the very fact of what Jesus did, that was unheard of. To touch a leper would automatically put you in the category of being unclean, and you'd have to be going outside the city. And so I think that was a very deliberate act upon Jesus' part. But the point I want to make here is this. The leper should not have been anywhere in the neighborhood of Jesus to be able to talk with him. Do you guys understand? Lepers were required, if they were going to come to the outskirts of the city and where people were to get garbage or to get, beg for food, they would have to shout out, unclean, unclean. In other words, saying, I have some illness and disease, loud enough so that people could move away. How traumatizing, and you know what I'm saying? Can you imagine if we had to have that with people? I mean, I know it's not as big of an issue nowadays, but I remember living in Hollywood back in the 90s when all the HIV and AIDS epidemic and everything, especially in that area, was going on. Can you imagine if we made HIV and AIDS patients yell out, HIV, HIV, wherever they went? We'd be like, oh, that's inhumane, that's not right, but that's what they literally had to do. And then, of course, in Jesus' day, people would just move away. The crowd would just part and go away from you. And I know we have reactions like that. I still remember from those days when a young boy, I don't remember exactly the name or the school, but remember he was HIV, and then he went to school, his mom sent him back, and all the parents had outrage, and they kind of shut down the school, and all the kids wouldn't go, and all these things happened, and they had a whole issue with all those things working out. But that's what's going on here. And here's this guy with leprosy that everybody could literally see, and he's coming in where he ought not to be, and as he's getting closer to Jesus, Jesus is not going away. Maybe the crowd is, I don't know. And he gets close enough to talk to Jesus, and he falls down, maybe a little distance away, maybe a few feet away, and Jesus steps over, maybe walks a few steps over and touches him. I don't know about you guys, but that's a huge risk that this man had to take, that this leper had to take. Because there was the risk of rejection. Jesus could have been, he's a Jewish guy, he could have said, wait, you're unclean, get away. Can you imagine being rejected in front of all the people? Get away. No, you I can't deal with. Everybody else I can deal with, but you I can't. I know it may not sound like, oh, well, really? But Jesus, I know who Jesus is. But he didn't know exactly, but he had to take that risk. And I don't know if you guys really think this way or not, but I think sometimes, whether we admit it or not, deep down in our hearts, we wonder if Jesus, if God really, really loves us. We question that. Maybe because of the experiences that we've had in our life. And so it's hard sometimes to say, Jesus, even as I am, even the stuff that's deep down in my heart, the sins and the thoughts that I've had, the things that I've done, even this, you can deal with this issue, you can deal with these things, and you accept me as I am. And it takes a risk to come before Jesus Christ. It's a risky business. It's being very, very, very vulnerable. And the thing is that we're ready oftentimes to run away when we feel like God's grace isn't enough. I've met too many people who are bitter towards the church because of what they've experienced within the church. And what I tell them is, that's something you may have experienced within the church, and I'm sorry for that, but that's not who God is. That's not who Jesus Christ is. So there's a lot of people out there who love Jesus but hate the church in some ways, and that's kind of tragic. But men and women, you know why I think there's a lot of brokenness and hurt that happens within the church? It's because people haven't dealt with their own issues and laid them bare before God and have received fully the love of God. And as a result, they still have all this judgmentalism, all this criticism, all these sharp words and behaviors within them because they haven't allowed God to do that. In order to have hope, not only do we have to admit our help, but we have to take the risk of letting Jesus see and come into our lives and just bear everything and love us in all those ways. In every way. To let God love you is something that requires, I think, a lifetime. I don't think I'm ever going to be done in this lifetime because there's always areas where I'm still surrendering and say, really, God? Really, God? The final thing that I see in this passage that this leper maybe doesn't do as good a job is at the end. After he's healed and immediately the leprosy went away, Jesus says this, he sternly charged him and he sent him away at once. And he said to him, see that you say nothing to anyone. So in other words, he says, don't say anything to anyone, but instead go and show yourself to the priest and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded for proof to them. In other words, there's an offering that you're supposed to take to the priest, and the priest would examine you, maybe for a few days, wash and check, and then see if you're truly clean, and then he would declare you clean, and you'd be back in the community. Verse 45, but he went, the leper, the ex-leper, he went out and began to talk freely about it and to spread the news so that Jesus could no longer openly enter a town, but was in desolate places, and people were coming to him from every quarter. I think there's something that I want to say about this that's, I don't want to say controversial, but the more I've read this story, I said, why do people, after Jesus heals them and he sternly charges them, not do what he says? Do you guys get what I'm saying? Is it Jesus kind of like just saying, oh, don't tell anybody, but then he kind of knows you will? No, I don't think so at all. He really didn't want him to say, sternly charges. I mean, there's no other way to say it. He just said very clearly, don't say anything to anyone. I mean, obviously your family, your friends, okay, that's fine, but don't go make a big fuss about this. Just go and show yourself to the priest. But instead, what he does is he goes out and he begins to talk freely about it. Do you guys understand something here? To recognize and to go and pursue the power and the healing and the transformation of Jesus, that's maybe where our relationship begins. But men and women, to have genuine hope in Christ, it's not enough to be touched by him, be loved by him. It's not enough to just be healed by him. We have to submit to his authority and what he asks us to do. Otherwise, you're not going to have hope. See, I've seen too many people who are saved and are Christians, and I really believe that they are. They had a salvation experience. But because they're in disobedience, because they're just doing what they think Jesus wants instead of what Jesus wants, what they think that Jesus should want, what they want to do for Jesus instead of what Jesus wants them to do, they're not very happy. They don't have much hope in their lives. Why? Because Jesus said, well, I never asked you to do that. I never, asked you to do that. Why are you all down? Why are you all discouraged? Why are you all depressed that didn't work out? Trust me, I see so many people building their own kingdoms, declaring that it is for the kingdom of God, that pursue wealth or that pursue a relationship, that pursue building a church or an organization or whatever it is, but it's really about them, not about the kingdom of God. And later on, they find despair and they fall down. It gets broken. They go, why? And they lose hope. Why? Because that's not what God called them to. When you do what God called you to do and you're under his authority, everything can fall down. But because you have that conviction deep down inside that you've done as best as possible what God calls you to do day in and day out, you have this sense of hope. You have this sense of confidence that God is with you. And see, the amazing thing to me about this is you cannot have unfailing hope unless you're submitting to his authority and his lordship as well as receiving his power and his love. We talked about authority a couple weeks, so I'm not going to go too much more into that, but I think that's such a critical thing for us to understand. Men and women, when you think about hope, the whole idea of hope, there will come times in your life when things are going to knock you around. What's going to be your foundation? How are you going to have that in your life? One of my, there's a movie you can go watch. It's really old and whatever else, but you can get it on video or you can download it, or I don't know if Netflix has it or not, but it's about a Catholic priest from the 1800s who went to go work on a leper colony in Molokai. So back then, the Hawaiian government was kind of independent, wasn't part of the United States quite fully yet, and there's just kind of some kind of relationship going on. But Father Damien went as a missionary to Molokai. And so Molokai was this island in the Hawaiian Empire, if you will, that all the Hawaiians that had leprosy were sent off to have a colony together. And so he felt a calling to go there. He was born in 1840. And he died in 1849 of leprosy, 49 years old. What was really interesting to me as I was reading that story was that he wrote a journal. And he wrote about the hopelessness that he saw when he first arrived. And that was one of the reasons that he went. Because he said, I want to give hope to the people who have no hope. And reading all the stories in the New Testament about lepers and of course, he prayed that they would be healed, but they weren't. And what was interesting is in the very beginning, the lepers kind of shunned him. So he was an outcast in the leper colony. You know why? Because here's what they basically said. You are whole. Of course you can believe in God. Look at us. How can we believe in God? But he worked earnestly. He built them houses. He treated them. He, tried to make their lives better. And he spoke the gospel. But, he just lived it out and he lived there. And because he didn't catch leprosy, I think like the first 16 years that he was there, as a result, he was left to come off the island here and there. But the United States really didn't want him to come back in. And so there was a lot of things that he had issues with. But he knew that it was pretty much a lifelong kind of thing that he was going to do. And he writes in his diary that one day he began to see the signs of leprosy upon his body. And that when he put his foot into a hot bath, he couldn't feel the heat, and he wasn't sure if the water was hot or not, or cold. And what was interesting is, of course, he went through a period of like, oh God, what's going on now? And then he began to experience, what some of the lepers experienced. But there was something that came to him that was quite different. He said, because of my faith in God, I see this now as a point of contact to be able to speak to the lepers, because I'm one of them now. And he began to understand about the incarnation of Christ into us, into a human being, and all these things. And then his ministry took off among the people. I mean, they started to, really believe in his character and his commitment after being all there all those years. But now seeing him, even with leprosy, continuing on in his ministry and his faith, they began to say, I want to believe the God that gives you hope in the same situation that we have. We missed out on something. It's not your circumstances, and it's not overcoming your circumstances that necessarily gives you hope. It's knowing who the source of hope is. It's risking and allowing God to love you where you're at. And it's the surrendering to his authority as completely as you can that gives you an unfailing hope to get you through everything. Men and women, I want to encourage you all this morning once again. The story of this leper is a story about you and me. It's a story about how Jesus says, I'm willing to make you clean. I desire to give you hope, and I'll help you. Just come to me. Let's pray together this morning as we close.